Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. If you follow the channel, you'll know that I've posted a number of videos on Cuba, and over the last 2 years, the situation has got progressively worse. And the state of play right now is that the country is in an absolute crisis. The economy has collapsed. And the government has now announced that it's introducing measures to try to fix this problem. And what they've announced is that they're increasing gasoline prices by 5 times, 500%. Electricity and gas prices will be going up by around 25%. And there will be subsidies removed from basic items such as food. So obviously from the Cuban population's point of view, none of this is going to help them at a time of absolute crisis. However, the government have decided that this is an absolute necessity to put Cuba back onto an even keel. So in today's video, we'll go through the details as to exactly what's going on in Cuba, how the government found itself in this situation, and why it's now having to increase the price of everything. We'll talk about what's going on with regards to the peso, because that's collapsed by around 20% since the start of 2024. And when you look at the purchasing power of the peso today, compared to where it was in 2019, there has been a 90% collapse in value. And actually, most people in Cuba today would prefer to use the US dollar. But some people are being paid in pesos, mainly people who are employed by the state. And those people are the ones who are suffering the most because the value of those pesos is reducing on a daily basis. So have a look at what's going on with the peso and compare the official rate to the black market rate. We'll then talk about what's going on with inflation. We'll look at the official inflation data, but we'll also talk about what's happening on the streets, because what's happening in reality is slightly different to the official statistics. We'll then talk about what's going on with gasoline prices, why the government have increased the price by 5 times, and what the impact of that is likely to be. We'll talk about the daily blackouts that are continuing in Cuba and what impact that's having on the economy. We'll talk about the rationing system and why the subsidies are now being removed. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen in Cuba over the course of the next 6 to 12 months and how the government are going to solve this crisis. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks over the last week or so, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time and effort that you've taken to do that. And if you've signed up as a patron, a YouTube member, or a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you so much. You're providing me with long-term support, which enables me to produce more videos. So thanks so much.
Snaking queues for petrol have become a regular feature of life in Havana in recent times. And blurry-eyed motorists have become accustomed to spending literally days in line for gasoline.
These lines have become the norm. It's tedious. We spend hours in line to fill up just 40 liters of fuel.
To address a cash crunch, the ruling Communist Party has raised the price of petrol 5-fold.
They're importing most of their oil, and so they're importing it at world market prices and selling it very much less. And so that's costing the government. They've got a huge fiscal deficit.
The price hikes are unpopular and have been met with apprehension.
They shouldn't raise prices that much. But what can we do?
When the price of fuel goes up, everything gets more expensive. If people need to go to hospital or travel somewhere, it's going to cost them more.
How much did it cost you to get to your house before?
From here to my house, 50 pesos.
And now?
150. They've all put their prices up.
These price hikes are part of what the Communist Party is calling a macroeconomic stabilization program. With US sanctions choking off hard currency inflows like never before, real salaries are plummeting. Cuba's president says he's managing a war economy.
This is not a package of neoliberal measures against the people, nor is it a crusade against small businesses, nor the elimination of the basic basket of goods.
In the short term, the move will spur inflation. And on an island where the average salary has dropped to the equivalent of just $16 a month, people are worried.
As a result of the relationship that Cuba built with the Soviet Union and particularly Russia during the Cold War period in the 60s and 70s, its infrastructure was built on oil, and Cuba has a heavy reliance on oil for the production of electricity. It generates around 90% of all of its electric using oil. And obviously, that's not a great position to be in right now. It was fine when Russia was giving it huge quantities of subsidised or free oil. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Cuba also formed a relationship with Venezuela. But unfortunately, when Venezuela hit the wall in terms of economic crisis, after it was sanctioned by the USA, the amount of oil that Venezuela was sending to Cuba fell, and that put Cuba into a very difficult situation. And the situation today is that Cuba doesn't have enough oil to be able to keep electricity running 24 hours a day, and so the country is experiencing blackouts, which occur at least twice a day for around 4 to 6 hours each.
Sometimes the power goes out for 4 to 6 hours. Government officials blame a lack of fuel to feed thermoelectric power plants. The shortages now affect nearly all facets of daily life. Due to the fuel crisis, long lines have formed at gas stations and sports tournaments have been suspended. The government says US sanctions have combined with an increasingly acute economic crisis to bring the fuel shortfall to a head. Cuba's economy demands about 125,000 barrels per day of fuel. Combining its own domestic oil production and what the country receives from Venezuela and Mexico, Cuba receives a total of about 129,000 BPD, more than enough to cover its stated needs. So how can the discrepancy between the Reuters calculations and the shortfall reported by authorities be explained? Jorge Piñón studies Cuba's energy infrastructure and supply at the University of Texas in Austin.
We do not see Cuba's fuel shortages as an external problem. This, in our opinion, could be an internal problem in the refining sector, problem in logistics, storage, the tankers in cabotage that run between Cuban ports. So the fuel deficit that Cuba says that it has today, in our opinion, is not supply, but mostly internal logistic problems.
All Cubans are entitled to basic food rations at cheap prices at the country's famous bodegas. And with the economy creaking, essential food rations have started arriving late.
The rice at the ration store hasn't come in yet this month, so I have a bit of rice left from last month, so I'll still have a bit to eat.
This week it was revealed that the Cuban government has asked the UN World Food Programme to help it get milk to children on the island.
As a result of its communist history, Cuba operates a ration system. The residents of Cuba all have ration books and they can exchange their coupons for different food substances each month. And this table shows an example of the food products that Cuban nationals are given on a monthly basis. So as you can see, everyone in Cuba is entitled to 7 pounds of rice, half a pound of beans, 4 pounds of sugar, 4 ounces of coffee, 1 pound of cooking oil, 1 pound of pasta, 1 kilogram of milk powder, 1 litre of soy yogurt, 1 pound of chicken, 5 eggs, 1 kilogram of salt every 3 months, 1 box of phosphorus supplement, and 1 bun-sized piece of bread every single day. So all of that sounds great, but unfortunately the Cuban government, at a time of crisis, have now decided that the cost of providing all of those rations to everybody in Cuba is too expensive, and so they're now cutting back on the rationing system. And only people who are deemed to be in financial crisis will be given access to all of those food products on a daily basis. One of Cuba's fundamental problems is that it's a net importer. It imports more than it exports. Cuba is a relatively small island, so it doesn't have that much in terms of natural resources. And the problems in Cuba were accentuated in the 1960s, 70s and 80s when it became a communist state and teamed up with Russia. And as a result of that, it was hit by widespread sanctions from the USA, which previously had been its biggest trading partner. So it cut off its biggest trading relationship to go all in on the communist idea. But unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, when the Soviet Union broke up in the early 1990s, Russia was no longer able to support Cuba, and as a result of that, it went into financial crisis, and it hasn't really recovered ever since that point. Now, as a net importer, the exchange rate between the Cuban peso and other currencies is obviously really important because that sets the prices of all of the products that it's importing in the home market. And the governments of Cuba operate what's known as a managed exchange rate. So they set an official exchange rate so it doesn't fluctuate in the international markets. And this chart shows the movement in the official exchange rate between the US dollar and the Cuban peso dating back to 1994. And what this shows is that in the mid-1990s, officially $1 was exchanging for around 1 Cuban peso. The official exchange rate was increased in the late 1990s to $1 to 23 Cuban pesos. However, in 1999, the official exchange rate was reset back to 1 after a devaluation of the peso. And it remained at that level until 2021, when the peso was once again devalued and the official exchange rate was reset to $1 to 24 pesos. Now, the problem with the official exchange rate is that it doesn't reflect reality. Over the last 30 years, the economy of Cuba has got significantly worse, and as a result of that, the attractiveness and therefore the value of the Cuban peso has fallen, but not according to the official exchange rate. And this chart plots the movement in the black market exchange rate between the US dollar and the Cuban peso, dating back to the start of 2021. And what you can see here is that back in 21, $1 was exchanging for around 50 Cuban pesos, so more than double the official exchange rate at that point. However, today, $1 is trading for around 320 Cuban pesos, which means that on the black market, the value of the peso has fallen by more than 6 times in the last 3 years. And the problem from the Cuban government's point of view is that the black market is the real exchange rate of the Cuban peso. That's what it's worth in real terms when you go to the store and try to buy something. And as a result of the continued devaluation of the peso in real money terms, the vast majority of people in Cuba now prefer to use the US dollar. Unless you're being paid by the state, who have to pay you in Cuban pesos, everybody wants to be paid in dollars, they want to hold their savings in dollars if they have any, and they want to pay for things in dollars because the value doesn't go down as rapidly as it does for the peso. As we've just seen, over the last 3 years, the value of the peso has fallen by more than 6 times. So that means that if you're being paid in pesos, you would have needed your salary to increase by at least 6 times over the last 3 years just to stay at the same level of purchasing power. And obviously that hasn't been happening. And the average salary in Cuba right now is around $16 per month. That is an incredibly low salary when you compare it to what's going on in the rest of the world. Now, as you know, I always like to look at what's going on with inflation because it should give us a really good indication as to what's happening to the price of everything in that country. And this chart shows the official rate of inflation in Cuba over the last 12 months. And one thing to note here is that the scale on the right-hand side doesn't start at 0. It actually starts at 30% and goes up to 48% at the top. And what this chart shows is that at the start of 2023, inflation was rising. It increased from around 42% to around 47%. The official rate of inflation then stayed in the mid-40s for the next 3 months and started falling in July, August, September, October, November, and in December the official rate of inflation fell to a 17-month low of 31.8%. Now obviously inflation of almost 32% isn't good, but when you compare it to what's been happening over the last 12 months, it looks like a relatively positive trend. However, I think this is a classic situation where statistics can be entirely misleading, because when you look at this graph, you start to think that things are moving in the right direction in Cuba, but that is far from the truth. There is an absolute crisis going on right now, and what that really tells us is that these official inflation figures aren't very reliable because there are shortages on the streets of Cuba right now. The value of the peso is falling on a daily basis. It's buying less and less. And the prices of things when they're actually available in the shops are going up. And if we quickly have a look at what's going on with interest rates, because that's something we always like to talk about when we're talking about inflation, because the two are usually intrinsically linked. This chart shows the movement in the official interest rate in Cuba dating back to June 1997. And as you can see, the official interest rate has remained entirely flat at 2.25% for the last 27 years, which tells us that Cuba is not operating like we would expect a normal economy to. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in Cuba is absolutely fascinating. Obviously, in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, Cuba was operating entirely as a communist country, And that worked well when it was teamed up with other countries that had large quantities of natural resources that they could share in exchange for things like programs whereby doctors from Cuba went over to countries such as Venezuela or Russia in exchange for all of those goods. But unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, firstly, as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union, which weakened Russia's position and meant that it was no longer able to give Cuba huge amounts of subsidized oil. And then later, the problems that Venezuela encountered when it was hit with sanctions by the USA. Cuba has been left to fend for itself. And unfortunately, the country simply doesn't have enough natural resources to be able to pay for everything that it needs to import. And to make matters worse, the infrastructure that's been built in Cuba is all dependent on oil. And obviously, over the last few years, the price of oil has skyrocketed as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which forced prices up, meaning that purchasing all of that oil became unaffordable from Cuba's point of view. And as a result of that, the country has been hit with blackouts for the last few years. And the problem that you have when you have blackouts is that it's really difficult to be productive. If you've got a company in Cuba and you need electricity, which obviously most of them would, to be able to operate, if you've got a blackout for 4 or 6 or 8 hours every single day, that means that you'll have to down tools and wait for the electricity to come back on. And because these blackouts are now planned on a daily basis, because the electricity generation just isn't enough to feed everybody, you know that you're not going to be able to operate. And so your workers are hanging around with nothing to do. And obviously your productivity goes down, you're producing less, and therefore you're earning less income. And so things like the increase in the gasoline price that's just been announced of 5 times becomes really unaffordable for you because you're still encountering the blackouts, you're still having problems in terms of productivity, but the price of things is going up. And that's what we're seeing right now in Cuba. The government have taken this approach whereby they've said, we need to introduce austerity measures. We need to reduce our costs to try to become more manageable from a macroeconomic point of view. But the problem with doing that is obviously it's increasing the price of everything for all of your citizens at a time when they're on their knees, they're already struggling. So very few people in Cuba can afford a 5 times increase in fuel prices. And as we saw in today's video, the problem with a 5-time increase in gasoline is that it feeds into the price of everything because people need to pay for transport and most goods have to be transported. And so transport costs are included in the final price. So increasing prices isn't going to help. And what we also saw is that the value of the Cuban peso has collapsed over the last 5 years and is continuing to fall on a daily basis. Now, the government of Cuba are oblivious to this because they've got an official rate of $1 to 24 pesos, but nobody in Cuba is using that rate. Everybody's using the black market rate, which is now up at around 320 pesos for $1. So obviously the difference between those two is astronomical. And as a result of that, the people in Cuba all want to use the US dollar. Nobody wants to be paid in pesos because the value is falling rapidly every single day. And nobody wants to hold their savings in pesos. So it's quickly becoming a redundant currency. And the problem that Cuba has is that it doesn't have enough US dollars as a government to be able to pay for all of the imports. So we've got a really vicious circle that's starting to form here. And unless Cuba gets some help, it's going to be in dire straits. And as an example of that, Cuba had to turn to the World Food Programme recently and ask for powdered milk for its children because it simply doesn't have enough money to be able to pay for it. And that's the first time that Cuba has done that in its history. So it really gives you an indication just how serious the problem is right now. Cuba can't even afford milk for its children. So Cuba desperately needs some help and some cash right now. And unfortunately, the usual point that everybody turns to is the IMF. But back in Fidel Castro's day, he burnt his bridges with the IMF, and that relationship has never been rebuilt. But Cuba desperately needs to find somebody to help it out. Otherwise, we could see a humanitarian crisis unfolding at some point over the next 6 to 12 months. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face. I've got some really exciting news for you. I've decided to give away another one of my statues, and this time it's this guy, the man on stilts. Now, if you've been watching my channel, you'll know that this is one of the original pieces that I've been showing in the background for the last few years. This is a truly amazing piece. I absolutely love it. And it's made by a British artist called Paul Moggetts, and he makes a limited number of each one of his pieces. And I've managed to secure a second one of these, but I'm giving this one away, which is the original one that I've had in the background for the last few years. And if you'd like to win it, you just need to buy a ticket in the raffle, which are priced at £1 each, which is around $1.30. So very affordable. So if you'd like to support the channel, rather than buying me a coffee or sending me a YouTube super thanks, why don't you buy a ticket in the raffle and you could have this in your home some point soon. Now, in terms of organising this, I've got an independent company to collect the cash and make the draw for me. So I won't be choosing it. It will be entirely at random. And I will post this anywhere in the world to whoever wins it. There is a possibility that you may need to pay a little bit of import duty depending on where you live and what the rules are. But I will send this anywhere. So if you'd like to win it, please buy a ticket in the raffle and good luck.